Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guest today is Dara Hoffman Fox. Dara is a queer-identified gender therapist in private practice in Colorado Springs. As a subject matter expert on transgender and non-binary issues, Dara is the creator of Conversations with a Gender Therapist YouTube channel, as well as the author of You and Your Gender Identity, A Guide to Discovery. We talk about Dara's path from becoming a therapist specializing in gender and helping others discover their own personal identity, to educating all people about gender diversity around the globe. Find more about Dara at darahoffmanfox.com and find their book at discoveryourgenderidentity.com or on Amazon. Hi, Dara. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Nick. Thank you for inviting me to be here today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here, having followed you online for a while and excited to chat with you more.
Yes, congratulations on this new podcast of yours.
Thanks. So, Dara, I know that you focus on working with the gender nonconforming community and transgender community as a therapist, and I thought that maybe you could start by sharing with us a little bit about how you became a therapist.
Sure. So let's see. I kind of like to work backwards. I've been in private practice for a little over 10 years, but it's been only since 2013 that I've been more so specializing in working with the transgender community. And before that, I finished graduate school in 2006, and the reason I went into graduate school to become a therapist is honestly, when I was 30, that's how old I was when I came to complete terms with realizing that I was gay the time I was married. So I had to get divorced. I didn't have to, but I did. And then I needed to go ahead and start making plans for life. And I always had being a therapist as something that felt interesting to me ever since I was a kid. My mom was a psychologist. And so I went ahead on that path of going to graduate school. And eventually, as I started working with more and more clients, I became known in the area. I'm here in Colorado Springs, which is a fairly conservative area, especially when I started in the early 2000s. It is known as the evangelical capital of the world, actually. And so a lot of people who were queer and trans and LGBT really had so few options of who they could go to as a therapist. So recognizing that there was a gap there, and I knew that for myself, obviously being queer, that was really important to me to create a safe space for people to come. So again, that was back early when I first started. And so it was more that the big umbrella of LGBT that I started seeing. And then, by the time 2013 rolled around, I just recognized I had probably a good 75% of my client base were transgender, because I was at that point the only therapist in Colorado Springs who people felt comfortable coming to explore their gender identity, to transition. And so at that point, I felt it was that feeling of having like a calling, and like my purpose finally was revealed to myself, that I was going to really focus. I still see other clients, of course, but really focusing on working with the trans community. And to me, what that meant was not only seeing everybody who I see as clients, but also starting a blog, eventually starting the YouTube channel, writing a book. So all of that happened over a period of years. So I think it's been really wonderful. It was very unplanned, but it feels perfect the way everything has unfolded up till today.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there was just a really big need for you to bring this work to your area. And I'm just glad that you were able to bring that forth to your community.
Yes, there sure is. Things have gotten better in Colorado Springs. And I also now have many other colleagues who I have made sure are aware of how to work with, specifically with trans clients. And that's really been great over the last couple of years. There's more options than just me, which is good, because even though it's great for business, it's not fair that people have to have only one gender therapist to choose from. So things are definitely improving.
Yeah. And so speaking of you working with other therapists, that's also something that you're focusing on right now. You're about to start, or by the time this airs, that we'll have started a Trans Affirming Therapist Academy. Can you share more about that?
Yes, thank you. So it's going to be through teachable.com. And by the time this episode airs, there'll be at least one course available. And this course in particular is going to help therapists who want to increase their competency working with non-binary clients. And so over the course of this year, I'm going to continue to put up more courses, and it's going to be called the Trans Affirming Therapist Academy. And I feel like there is a strong need. I'm asked by a lot of therapists, where's information I can find about how to be just in general better at this? And so, like you said, when it came to there was a need in Colorado Springs for an LGBT affirming therapist. Now I'm hearing definitely therapists across the country really are interested. And I'm talking about a lot of straight cisgender therapists having a real heart for this work and wanting to know how they can do it right.
Yeah. And I would say even for people like me, I'm, a queer identified therapist in San Francisco. And I would say even I would probably need some kind of extra education around this kind of thing, because it's not a big part of my own personal experience, my own personal story, being a cisgendered person myself. And so it's always helpful just to have a little bit more information to know how to work with trans and gender nonconforming clients. So.
Good point. Absolutely.
So I also know that you do a lot of work on social media with your YouTube channel and Facebook, and you've written books. And you've really reached a lot of people all over the country and probably even all over the world. And I bet that you've heard some really amazing and challenging stories from followers and readers. And I wonder if there is one that really sticks out to you that feels memorable and powerful or struck you in any way.
I would say you're absolutely right. Just thanks to the power of the internet through my YouTube channel and Facebook page especially, it's been incredible to encounter people from across the world. Every time somebody orders my book from, Australia or Russia, it just amazes me. Like, how did they find out about this? Oh, it's the internet, and, wanting to reach out. So I would say for me, back in, again, 2014 or so, I was getting so many emails from people who were wanting help with exploring their gender identity, and they needed to have somebody really like a therapist, holding their hand through this process. But of course, for one, not everybody can afford a therapist. People are living in areas where there's not going to be gender therapists who they can work with. And through that experience is why I decided to write my book, which is called You and Your Gender Identity, A Guide to Discovery. And there's one person in particular I can think of who, they often say when you write a book, you imagine who are you writing this to? Mm-hmm. There's like a couple of people where I thought, okay, these are people who've reached out to me with their questions about their gender identity, and I'm going to keep them in mind as I write this. And one person in particular, I kept them updated all along as I was writing it and checked in with them. I can't remember offhand. They lived in the United States, but outside of Colorado for sure. And as I continued to send chapters of my book to this person, they would work through an exercise, and literally their immediate response was like, that just changed my life. Keep writing exactly what you just did. And then by the time I finished the book, they had figured out what they wanted to do. They decided to transition and move forward. And so I would say this person, and they still write me updates every now and then, like, oh, actually, I think they lived in Canada because it took them a really long time to start hormones, longer than it does in the United States. But yeah, and then they said, I decided to use this as my pronoun, and this is my new name. And now I'm going to start reaching out to people in the community like you suggested. So it's a perfect example of where, I'm thinking of this one person, and I wrote this book in large part for them, and then knowing that there's still actually thousands of people who have that same experience with that.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's amazing. So tell us more about your book. I know it's called You and Your Gender Identity, and you talk about the 3 stages of self-discovery. What is the book for, and who is the book for?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of people, first of all, ask like age-wise who can read it. So obviously it is for adults. I work primarily with adults, but I would say for those who are teenagers who can read on a young adult level can certainly absorb this book as well. So it's over 250 pages, and it's a combination of education and also exercises, journaling prompts, different checklists, things like that. Honestly, that's the kind of book that when I want to work through something about myself, I feel like I need something I can write in. I need to be able to, somebody ask me questions, really hard questions that I'm going to answer in response. Mm-hmm. So the reason I'm a big fan of The Hero's Journey, mm-hmm. Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung. And so I felt inclined to create this with that in mind, knowing that, for instance, the first stage needs to be preparation. And before you can even, like, if you imagine you're getting ready, you could be a hero getting ready to go on a journey, or if you're getting ready to play a video game, you need to make sure you're prepared before you even step out that door. You know, what's going to be in your little satchel or in your backpack? Who are your allies? Who's your mentor? You know, things like that. Imagining even, like, for instance, Luke Skywalker, Star Wars is one of the best analogies for the hero's journey. You know, getting ready to venture forth. What is it that he had to do before he actually started forward on his journey? And so I feel like if people kind of take that step-by-step process, they'll be more prepared to go what's into something probably even more difficult than they ever could imagine when it comes to exploring their gender identity questions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wonder if you think it's important for people to have a team to help them prepare and go on this journey, and how they can begin to acquire that team.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a chapter that does have to do with forming your team, and I go through each of the different people you can consider having on your team. You know, I definitely mention, like I said, the mentor. You know, in a lot of ways, your therapist could help as that wise figure in your life who can help you along the way. I mentioned that there's people such as maybe you have a cheerleader who pretty much is always going to be very positive, upbeat, encouraging. You might have a tough love friend who is going to really keep it real for you and be very supportive and want to help you through this. But if there's anything that they feel like they need to point out to you that you could probably either be working harder on or taking into consideration, there's going to be people who are really good at maybe finding resources. So let's say that's, you know, whatever area of life you're not quite as good at, finding somebody who knows, like, hey, how do I find a gender therapist? How do I find a support group? Knowing that there are definitely people out there who can help with that. I think it's important to know that these can obviously be people in your life that you interact with, let's say locally, but because of the internet, there's so many different ways you can explore different groups online and find these types of people, you know, even internationally, to be able to form your support team. So that's just an example of a few people you can have on that team.
Great. And what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that queer folk have trying to figure out their gender as they start this journey?
Good question. Fear comes up number one for me. And that's also part of the preparation that I go through, probably at least 3 chapters, where it has to do with trying to step back and really, first of all, really listen to what are the fears you have before you go forward, getting to know those fears, setting aside time to really to spend time with those fears so that they're not constantly bombarding you. So that's also part of managing the fears. But I mean, absolutely, there's going to be really realistic things that could happen when somebody explores their gender identity. If they decide to transition, who are the people in their lives that they could potentially end up losing? Could it be at the sacrifice of a certain career path, their personal safety? So, you know, all the work I've done with clients, I've recognized that a lot of these fears that come up are incredibly realistic, but also seeing how is it that you can still carry on, move forward, and explore. Because I think a lot of times people know deep down more so their true gender identity than they actually think. It's the fear that's blocking them. They might get close, and then that fear train just comes running right through and throws them off. And then they kind of take a step back and they try again. And so I think that's why it's really important to recognize that is a completely normal part of this process. You can expect it to even get worse as you're going along. It's like, I love the movie Inception because it shows like the closer you get to your true self, the more intense each level you move through gets like really hard. And it's because your fears are just like your ego is throwing everything at you possible to try to get you to stop at that point.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good analogy. I kind of forgot about that. So.
Oh, I use it all the time. That movie is amazing as a hero's journey.
Yeah. So we were talking about the team, creating a team, and that finding a therapist or working with a therapist is one of those challenges or part of that process. And I know that for most queer people, it can be hard or even scary to reach out to a therapist, especially for people who might not be in very diverse areas or larger cities or something like that. And you've produced some content about helping queer people, gender nonconforming people find a therapist. And I wonder if you could share a little bit of some of your quick tips about how to help people find a good therapist.
You bet. Yeah, there's a video on my YouTube channel where I addressed this recently because, again, I did see through a lot of social media that there's a lot of people really nervous about that process, understandably. So I would say like the best case scenario would be if you could find an actual gender therapist, which really means like if someone calls themselves that, that means they really have expertise and knowledge in this. And the most direct route to finding that is to go to the WPATH website, and that's the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and it's wpath.org. They have a directory in there where you can, and they actually have, besides just therapists, they have all sorts of medical professionals too that you can do a search for. So let's say you go into there and you're lucky enough to go in there and you're like, wow, there's somebody right here in my town. That's not going to happen for everybody. And so in the video I made, I talk about the different ways you might need to try to find this. I find that through Psychology Today, there's a portal called Find a Therapist. And so you can go into this portal and you can type in your zip code, and then you can indicate specifically that you want a therapist who is going to work with trans clients. And then you'll have this big list of therapists who pop up. Now, the thing is that at least you know you have a bit of a start in trying to find a therapist. But some of those therapists, for instance, they might think they're very trans aware, but they might not actually realize they aren't. So that's where the interview comes into play. And so my advice about when you're getting ready to go interview, first of all, that's my first piece, is that you get to go interview the therapist. Some therapists offer it for free as a consultation. Others may not. So maybe you can send these questions through email and just say, hey, I want to make sure you're a good fit for me. The kind of questions you want to ask is, first of all, like, are they familiar with the WPATH standards of care? Like the aforementioned organization that I mentioned, these are standards of care that a therapist, if they aren't aware of them, that is probably not the right therapist to go to. They're only going to be able to get you so far, and then they're going to have a lot of misinformation. You can print out your own copy for free through the WPATH website and take a look at the standards of care, and you'll be able to know, oh, so by the way, you can ask a therapist, hey, I just need a letter for hormone therapy. You know, how long do you need to see me for that? And if the therapist says, well, we need to meet for at least a year, then I can write the letter, you know that they are not informed about the current standard. You can technically meet with a person once, write them a letter, and call it an assessment as opposed to counseling. So my advice is for somebody to look at the standards of care, ask very specific questions so that you know if that therapist has heard of them and are aware of them. If you are, I would say, especially if you're non-binary, there are some therapists who are trans aware, but it's more of a binary transition going from male to female or female to male. Definitely check in with this therapist to say, okay, I'm actually wondering if I'm non-binary or I am non-binary. So where's your level of experience with that? And then just continue you'll be able to hear in their language that they use with you if they are at that level of knowledge that they claim to be or not.
Yeah. And I'll also say from my experience that I feel like I'm pretty aware of all of these issues and comfortable enough to work with people who are within the non-binary spectrum or gender non-conforming spectrum. But if I had a client who came in who wanted to work particularly on their gender issues or transitioning or hormone therapy or anything like that, I would not feel comfortable working with them because I don't know enough. Whereas if they were someone who was just gender nonconforming, but they wanted to talk about relationship or family or work, then I feel comfortable working with that. So for our listeners, there's not just only the level of awareness that the therapist has, but also like the different issues that they may want to work on. So, I think there can be some flexibility there too.
Absolutely. Yeah, because like I've said before to other therapists who are curious about how to work with this population that, for instance, I'm not an expert when it comes to trauma therapy. So I'm still going to, I might have a client who wanted to explore their gender identity. And once we finish that, if it's like, wow, there's some EMDR work that you need, I would then need to refer them out to a different therapist who would be, like you said, like, oh yes, this therapist doesn't need to get them through that gender questioning phase or get them started on hormones or surgeries, but they sure are completely understanding and open as to how to work with somebody who's trans through this process of trauma therapy. So that's a great point for your audience, to remember what is it besides just maybe gender exploration that you might want to do. But if you've already gone through that and you're just looking for a therapist who can help you through life issues, to be able to feel out their level of, at that point, it could be trans friendly, could be plenty enough.
Yeah, like I would just qualify myself as trans friendly and trans aware, but I wouldn't say that I'm a specialist in gender identity or transitioning and that kind of thing. So,
well, it's great you mentioned that, because one thing your audience can keep in mind is I think of it as this 3-tiered system, like you just mentioned, where they could say to somebody, what would you consider yourself? Trans friendly, trans aware, or trans knowledgeable? And then it's kind of self-explanatory so that they can say, oh, here's where I would fit. And then that client can say, okay, great. It sounds like you would actually fit what I need, or, oh, I actually need somebody who's going to be more on that knowledgeable side. Do you have any advice about who I could contact instead?
Yeah, exactly. I've been part of other therapist communities that have sort of subspecialties, and they use the same kind of tiered labeling for themselves too, just to help clients navigate through that better.
Cool.
So Dara, I wonder if you can share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
I love this question because it's not something I've thought of in a while, but I'm going to think back to when I was baby queer. So I would have been 30, was almost 15 years ago. And this is when, after I finished graduate school, I was a little burned out and I wanted to work somewhere else for a while instead of jumping right into counseling. And I went to my local Pride Center here in Colorado Springs, and the executive director, his name is Ryan Acker. He's no longer the ED of the organization, unfortunately, isn't around anymore. But I remember I went in and said, hey, I just at least would like to volunteer here. And because I just came out and I, need community and people. And he actually said, well, we just received a grant and it was funded through the tobacco industry, because we were needing to do, it was kind of like their punishment. They had to set aside money to help with communities that had a disparity.
Oh.
So for instance, LGBT people have a higher percentage of smokers. And so this grant was able to fund a job position for me at the Pride Center. And Ryan was such a mentor to me during that time. And I tell a lot of people too that one of the first questions he asked me in my interview that I felt really uncomfortable answering, because I didn't have a lot of experience, was he asked me, what's your experience working with the transgender community? And at the time I had none, zero. I had met, as far as I had known, nobody who was transgender. And so being able to work at the local Pride Center and actually finally get to meet people who are trans, like that was such the beginning for me. I try to tell people, like, I didn't always know everything I do know about the transgender community. There's a person who lives here in Colorado Springs who knew me back then, and whenever she sees me, she says, do you remember I'm the first trans person you ever met? And it's so true. Like I said, that was, a good 15 years ago that happened. So I just see the way that Ryan was able to mentor me, introduce me to people I had never met before, and teach me about social activism was a huge part of that. Like I said, Colorado Springs conservative, so we'd go to city council and we'd do marches and protests. And this is when Pride Fest was surrounded by people wearing Grim Reaper costumes. And,
oh, wow.
Yeah, it was awful. And so being able to go to focus on the family and like protest outside the doors, that really ignited what I didn't know I had inside of me, of a real social activism spirit. So just on so many levels, that it was only about a year and a half that I worked there, but extremely pivotal in terms of me being able to then carry on what I learned from there into what I do today. So thanks, Ryan. I'm going to tell you that I talked about you on the podcast.
Thank you, Ryan. So Dara, where can people find you and find out more about your work and your offerings?
I would say start off with my main website, And because that's just darahoffmanfox.com, it's a hub for the different blog posts that I've written over the years. And also I post all my videos there. Any interviews and podcasts that I've done are there. And also I'm going to, anytime I create a new resource, you'll be able to find it through my website. I mentioned my YouTube channel, so you can look that up under Dara Hoffman Fox, also on Facebook. So the bigger brand is Conversations with a Gender Therapist. So you can look that up in YouTube as well. So it's a page, that you can follow. And for those who read the book, You and Your Gender Identity, A Guide to Discovery, actually you don't have to read the book. You can just look up that group on Facebook. It's a closed group. So you do need to have moderators who kind of screen you beforehand. Great. But it's about 4,000 people at this point. Wow. Of just great for people who are exploring their gender identity, but there's also people who've already done it. And so they're there to help kind of form that support team like we talked about earlier. Let's see, if you're a therapist and you're interested in learning more about the Trans Affirming Therapist Academy, you can look that up under teachable.com. And I'll also be happy to provide a link to Nick to share in the show notes for that.
Okay, great. I just love how many resources you're offering and how much community you're creating out there for people online.
It's my pleasure. It actually, like I said, it feels like so much like a calling and a purpose. So everything that's evolved from here, it does feel like I'm connecting with the world in this way I never could have imagined that could have happened to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dara, thank you for being on the show, and I look forward to hearing more about how all of your projects continue to grow.
I appreciate you giving a platform for me to talk about these very important subjects. Thanks, Nick.
To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.